Good evening, everyone. It's so nice to have you here. I'm Jen Gray, I'm Artistic Director of Forward, and I have the pleasure of introducing our guest lecturer this evening. Forgive me for reading this. Before I do, I just want to make sure that all of you have seen, we have some packets with some photographs, some images that will be referred to. You also have the option, if you want to see a really high quality image, you can zoom in on. There's some signs with QR codes around, and you can use that to get these pulled up right on your phone. So I encourage you to do one or the other of those two things. Without further ado, Thomas Dale is Professor of Art History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and President of the Medieval Academy of America. His research and teaching explore the visual culture of medieval Europe and the Mediterranean. His publications have considered late antique clothing from Egypt, monsters in the cloister, concepts of portraiture, relics in the cult of the saints, race and cultural encounter. His most recent book, Pygmalion's Power, Romanesque Sculpture, the Senses, and Religious Experience from Penn State University Press, explores the power of sculpted images to come alive in the imagination and their particular appeal to multiple senses within the devotional practices and rituals of medieval European Christianity. He is currently at work on a new book project focused on race and cultural encounter in medieval Venice. I hope you are looking forward to this talk as much as I am, and without further ado, Professor Dale.
Thank you very much, Jen, for inviting me, and thank you all for turning out. It's been a great pleasure to read the script of this play and see how a modern playwright looks back at the Middle Ages and uses it as a means of considering a topic that we all face. Our shared humanity means shared mortality, which is a central theme to this play. So this is an art history lecture, which means I want you to follow along with the visual images, because that's what I'm going to be focusing on. And I'm going to cue you when it's time to change images, just like those old educational films. There's a little, it's number one and then number two. So I'm going to be doing that. It's a kind of strange thing to do, but I'll do it anyway. And I'm also going to read this so that I keep to my time and there's enough chance for you afterwards to ask any questions you may have. So, image number one. Midway through Act 1 of The Amateurs this evening, you're going to hear the character who plays the role of the physic, or doctor, in a medieval play, recite the words of a rhymed refrain in Latin. Vita brevis brevitur, in breve finietur, mors venit velociter, etc. I won't read the whole thing. And this translates roughly as, life is short and it'll end soon. Death comes quickly and spares no one. Death destroys everyone and is merciful to no one. Now, this speech expresses a common sentiment in late medieval European culture during a time in which there was a particularly high mortality rate due to plague and war. Artists sought to cope with this grim reality through visual images that simultaneously express horror and humor, universal and individual experience of death. The common example is shown in the handout at number 1. Here, the dialogue between the 3 living and the 3 dead kings from an early 14th century illuminated manuscript of the Book of Hours. These images and texts were not only a reminder of death, but also a prompt to prepare for a good death in particular. Medieval Christianity believed this could be achieved by living a good and pious life, acknowledging one's vices, including the 7 deadly sins described in the play, and by embracing virtue in the present life. In my brief presentation tonight, I want to explore with you how and why late medieval European art dwelt so much on the macabre. That is, the images of skeletons and corpses and decaying flesh, and what such images might contribute to our understanding of the play as it oscillates between the era of medieval play in the 14th century and the AIDS pandemic of the 1980s and 1990s. I'm going to begin with some brief background on the plague and show a couple of images of the plague in 14th century art. And then I'm going to turn to the history of macabre images before and after the plague and show how they promoted self-knowledge and coping with death. And finally, I'll conclude with some brief observations on the intersections within the plague between medieval and modern responses to death and pandemic, and the recuperative role of art, broadly defined. So, image number 2. The first and third acts of the Amateurs are set during the 14th century and refer explicitly to the pandemic known as the bubonic plague, which devastated Western Europe, Asia, and the Mediterranean basin with particular force between 1346 and 1353. But the plague originated at least a century earlier in the Mongol Empire, and plague spread along military routes and with foodstuffs via ship from the region north of the Black Sea to Europe and North Africa and further east to China. And you can see this on the map in the handout on the left. There was a 30 to 40% mortality rate in most regions, but much higher losses in major cities such as Cairo, where over 60% died at the time. And by 1500, the plague had spread to nearly half of the known inhabited world at the time. As Giovanni Boccaccio describes it in the Decameron in the 14th century, quote, "The first sign of the plague was that swellings appeared in the groin and the armpits. Some of the swellings became as large as an apple. Sometimes they were the size of an egg. The deadly swellings then began to spread in all directions over the body. Then the disease changed. Black or red spots broke out, sometimes on the thigh or on the arm." Now you can see something of what the plague looks like in a 15th century German print on the handout. It shows how physicians tried to remove the plague, which took the form of a bubo, a lump on the body, by cutting it off. But in practice, of course, this is a very crude kind of treatment, and mortality rate remained very high. Number 3. Although medieval images of plague victims are relatively rare, it's generally believed that the proliferation of macabre images of corpses and skeletons in later medieval art were prompted by the omnipresence of corpses struck down by plague. The eyewitness account of the plague in Tournai, in present-day Belgium, authored by Gilles Le Muzy on your handout, is accompanied by an image depicting the overwhelming process of burying the dead, with the living bearing coffins to an outdoor cemetery. We see one shrouded body in the middle of the composition being lowered into the burial ground. But mainly what we see are a series of anonymous coffins. The anonymity of mass burial is a theme to which the characters in the play repeatedly return. For example, Hollis laments of her brother's death. "Who's to remember my Henry on a pyre of everyone we've ever known?" Number 4 in your handout. A second image from Gilles de Muzy's chronicle shows how the townspeople, seeking a scapegoat on which to blame the plague, rounded up the Jewish inhabitants, put them in prison, and then set them on fire. I mention this horrific event because the physician or doctor in the Amateurs reveals himself to be a Jew and tells how he witnessed his community being trapped in a wooden structure without windows and set on fire. This is a grim anticipation of the Holocaust in the 20th century. Number 5 in your handout. The Florentine painter Giovanni dal Biondo renders the plague more tangibly as a sudden and unexpected loss of life in his St. Sebastian triptych dating from around 1375. At lower right and above, we see people leaving the corpses of their family members outside their homes on the street, and carts drawing up to transport the bodies to the cemetery. The supernatural source of the plague is attributed to a black winged demon who appears at the upper left, reinforcing a common belief of the time that sinful behavior provoked the plague. At lower left, we see the Virgin Mary dressed in pale purple robe, and Saint Sebastian dressed in green, with their hands clasped in prayer, responding to the townspeople who kneel before them, seeking relief from the plague. An early Christian saint from Rome, Saint Sebastian was one of the most prominent and popular plague saints of the 14th century. Number 6. In the central panel of the same triptych, Saint Sebastian's suffering body is shot through with arrows as he's martyred by the Romans for professing his faith. In the 14th century context, his pierced body would have been understood as a metaphor for how his body took on the pain that afflicted those who were suffering from the plague. And the wounds were equated with the sores that spread over the infected bodies. As Sebastian's cult spread throughout Italy to cities around the peninsula, including Florence, it was believed that beholding and praying to his image would ward off or heal the plague, while also warning of the general transience of life and the uncertainty of the hour of death. 7a. The roots of these macabre images of skeletons and bodily decay that become so common in the period of the plague can be traced back to monastic culture in the early 12th century. A sculpted relief from the monastery of Saint-Pierre at Moissac in Languedoc, France, for example, depicts the decaying body of Lust at right as a once beautiful nude woman with long tresses of hair and ample breasts attacked by serpents, raising her arms in prayer as a skeletal demon symbolizing death abruptly seizes her arms. In monastic culture, this image of the decaying body was used to contrast the spiritual and worldly values, the ascetic life of prayer and fasting with the secular life of bodily appetites and the attendant sins of gluttony and lust. Monastic culture, in turn, influenced the broader religious culture of medieval European Christianity. As we see it right in the image at 7b, which shows the late 13th century figure of the Tempter of the World from Strasbourg Cathedral in France. The Tempter is dressed as a crowned prince in an elaborate robe and holds out the proverbial apple to the foolish virgins who embrace his offer of worldly pleasure rather than the invitation of Christ as the bridegroom. This comes from the parable in the Gospel of Matthew, which is describing the wise and foolish virgins who are prepared or not prepared for entry into heaven or hell at the end of time. The handsome prince's robe is slit open at the back to reveal a decaying body, attacked by worms and toads, and thus the fleeting nature of human life and earthly pleasures. Number 8. The familiarity of medieval audiences with corpses was also prompted by expansive warfare in the 13th and 14th centuries. The Morgan Crusader Bible shown here is a 13th century picture book that recasts the biblical narratives of the military conquests of King David and King Solomon as models for medieval crusaders who were attempting to retake the Holy Land. In the scene of Saul defeating the Ammonite kings, biblical warriors are depicted as medieval knights on horseback, wearing chainmail, and using siege towers and catapults to assail the Ammonite city. Meanwhile, the defeated Ammonites are represented in gruesome images of bleeding corpses trampled under horses' hooves. Number 9. We have to wait until the early 14th century to see the performance of the Macabre as a more direct confrontation between the living and their future corpses in the representation of the 3 living and the 3 dead kings. This example that I've already introduced at the beginning of my talk comes from the Book of Hours of Robert de Lisle from around 1310. In this illuminated image, a text complements image, one another in dialogue, as it were, on either side of the page. As if in a play, we have a dialogue between the living and the dead that contrasts the worldly pleasures, fine clothes, and status of the kings in their current lives at left, with their future selves in the form of corpses in various states of decay at right. The first living king is dressed in an ermine-lined blue cloak and a long golden tunic, holding a falcon on one arm, the ultimate status symbol in the Middle Ages for the aristocrat, referring both to hunting and to amorous pursuits of courtly love. He exclaims, "Friends, look what I see. Unless I've gone quite mad, my heart shakes with great fear. See there, 3 shades together. How ugly and strange they are, rotten and worm-eaten." To which the first dead king responds, "Lord, do not forget because of this bird nor for your bejeweled robes that you're not obeying well the laws that Jesus Christ has commanded by his holy will." And the theme here is the vanity and brevity of worldly trappings and the common fate for all bodies to be rotten and wormy. The setting of this warning is in an early example of the layman's prayer book, known as the Book of Hours. It comprises a series of texts to be recited at 8 times of the day, including songs and petitions, but also the office of the dead. The idea was that to die well, one needed to be prepared for it to come at any time. And this meant reading through the funeral liturgy in advance, having one's will ready, leaving one's earthly goods to one's family and appropriate charities, leaving funds to endow masses for the repose of one's soul. So macabre images were not just intended to be gloomy and frightening for the living, they were an essential ars moriendi, an art of dying well. Number 10. We find this same theme represented on a larger scale for public viewing along the walls of the cemetery of Pisa in Tuscany, known as the Campo Santo, literally the holy field, because the very ground in which people were buried was sanctified by earth imported from the Holy Land. The fresco attributed to Buonamico Buffalmacco was painted just before or immediately after the outbreak of plague in Italy during the 1340s. It depicts the story of the living encountering their corpses as part of a larger composition of the triumph of death. At upper right, a battle is waged between angels and demons for the souls of the dead. Below to the right, an idyllic scene shows well-dressed men and women engaged in courting in a luxuriant garden with music playing. While further to the left, aristocrats are struck down en masse by the angel of death. The universality of death is expressed by juxtaposing the princes and merchants with disabled and indigent bodies, reaching out with outstretched arms to heaven above. Further along to the left, we see a hunting party on horseback encountering the 3 tombs of the dead, open to reveal various states of decay. And finally, at upper left, by contrast, we see the hermit saints engaged in prayer and meditation, offering a clear contrast between the simplicity of their contemplative life and the worldly pursuits of the hunt and lovemaking below. They offer a reminder of the role of monks in praying for the dead, but also of their special status as closer to God, already, quote, dead to this world, unquote. Number 11. Urban cemeteries like the Campo Santo in Pisa and the Cemetery of the Innocents in Paris were spaces of regular encounters between the living and the dead. Rather than eschewing the sight of death or institutionalizing it, as we often do in hospital rooms today, medieval people aspired to die in the home, surrounded by family. And most people were buried in public cemeteries where the living regularly came to remember the deceased. There they encountered the skeletal remains of previously buried corpses that were removed from the earth to charnel houses, literally houses of bones, once the flesh had decayed. The image of the Cemetery of the Innocents, shown in the upper left of your handout, shows piles of bones arranged in the attic, above galleries around the open-air cemetery. Cemetery enclosures were often adorned with frescoes depicting the dance of death, or what we sometimes call by the French title, the danse macabre, in which life-sized figures of the living and the dead are depicted joining a kind of ring dance around the cemetery. All the ranks of society are included in the performance of the dance of death, and the dialogue between the living and the dead, ranging from Pope and Emperor at the head of the procession to the peasant farmer, clerk, and hermit at the lowest level of the social hierarchy. The inscriptions and images of all ranks of society allowed the visitors to anticipate their own death, projecting themselves into the dance and performing the texts, and they read them as they read them aloud. And I can't help but recite this and think at the same time of the music of Camille Saint-Saëns. You know that piece? You know, that wonderful piece. So that is the Danse Macabre. Of course, it's much more recent in date, but it goes back to this medieval text and this idea of a dance and of music accompanying the dance. Number 12. Now, another way in which the late medieval Christian was prompted to discover the future self in the macabre body was through the development of a new form of tomb, particularly common in Northern Europe, known as the transient or cadaver tomb. The early 15th century tomb of Archbishop Henry Chicheley of Canterbury, shown in the picture in number 12, is a typical example. Below, the mortal corpse is depicted naked, laid out on a burial cloth, a skeletal structure emerging from just beneath the flesh, an image that imagines the corpse buried beneath the tomb, but here made visible to the spectator. Above, on the other hand, we see Chicheley performing the role of archbishop, reclining atop the tomb, yet alert and fully vested as an archbishop in an embroidered dalmatic and mitre, and with the crozier, his pastoral staff, in his right hand, as angels lift him heavenward, and he prays for his own resurrection. This is both the image of the archbishop's persona as his office, as occupant of his office, and of his future body resurrected. Placed within the sacred space of his cathedral, the tomb reincorporates the deceased into the community of the living through memory and ritual. Its inscription specifically addresses the viewer with an appeal to be remembered, but also as a reminder of the reversals of fortune and the social leveling brought about by death. I was a pauper born, then to primate here raised. Now I am cut down and served up for worms. Whoever you may be who will pass by, I ask you for your remembrance. So it's the archbishop speaking through his tomb And still today, when you go to Canterbury Cathedral, you can see it. You can have that dialogue with both the mortal body and the resurrected body of the Archbishop. Number 13. The careful observation of the corpse as a symbol of individual mortality and transience and the passage to the afterlife reflects another very important factor in the performance of the Macabre in the 14th century. And that is the medical practice of dissection, which had previously been banned. The church was still very queasy and squeamish about this idea and condemned it. Guido de Vigevano was a court physician to the King of France, Philip VI, in the middle of the 14th century, when he composed his treatise on anatomy and provided a series of visual aids to a text based on the ancient anatomical text of Galen. His drawings offer a step-by-step unveiling of the inner structure of the human body, peeling back the layers to reveal the material self. Presented to the King of France in 1345, this work clearly presented a mirror of the king's own mortality. One of the chief roles of the physician of the king was to perform an anatomy at the time of his death, to remove the organs and prepare the corpse for burial, with the organs often distributed to different sites of royal patronage, spreading around the king's powerful body. And also, the king hoped, spreading around the potential for intercessory prayer on his behalf. Number 14. It seems hardly surprising that the earliest example of a cadaver tomb was made for a distinguished physician and the author of medical treatises, a certain Guillaume d'Arsigny of Laon in northern France. This effigy of the corpse was originally part of a larger double-decker tomb with a fully clad image of the body lying in state above the decaying corpse. The inscription of Guillaume's tomb stresses a scientific understanding of the process of decomposition of the body, while also referring to the physician's personal relationship with God. I return to God and nature, the simple elements of my being. May the acts of the composite be pleasing to God. So yet again, this powerful sculptural image, a very shocking image for the time. It was unusual to see a full-length, life-sized image of the corpse in a tomb. It spoke to people quite literally through its inscription, and people were used to reading inscriptions aloud at this time in the Middle Ages. Number 15. The intersection of plague, images of the macabre, and notions of divine punishment. These all bring us back to the play and its use of a medieval setting to reflect upon more recent pandemics, including AIDS, and we might add COVID-19, which broke out after the play was performed for the first time. Act 1 of the play opens with the actors practicing the medieval play, Noah's Ark. God says that he sees his people, quote, in deed and thought are lost in sin so bold. And he berates the 7 deadly sins: pride, anger, envy, covetousness, gluttony, sloth, and lust. Now this is the pretext for punishing the world with a flood that only Noah and his family and 2 examples of each species of animal and bird will be saved from. An early 14th century image of Noah's Ark on your handout thus brings us back to focus on the macabre preoccupation with the corpse. Male and female corpses appear beneath the ark within the floodwaters, alongside a horse and other animals. It is another form of plague image, if you will. Massive destruction of the population, emblematized by the corpses floating in the waters, but also a division between the saved and the condemned. The 40-day journey in the ark is a form of quarantine, which comes from 40 in Italian, 40. 40 days quarantine, we still use that term today. It's the 40 days that saves them from the destruction of the flood, that separates the good from the bad in the biblical text. What I've gleaned from reading the play, you will shortly see, is that it accepts the reality of these moments of pandemic and massive loss of life, but also urges us not to condemn the victims. The characters in the play question who was good and evil among themselves, and who would be saved in the ark. But instead, they focus on prompting us to appreciate the lives we live, which could so easily be taken away from us through no fault of our own. And finally, I come to number 16, my conclusion. The enduring power of macabre imagery to confront the crisis of pandemic and plague is signaled by modern artists who used it to respond to the AIDS crisis in the 1980s and 1990s. Keith Haring, for example, depicted skeletal male bodies and on occasion performed the macabre himself by marking his own body as a ghostly white-skinned skeleton to shock a complacent American public and give a voice to the gay community which suffered the loss of so many lives at the time. Likewise, in the amateurs, the medieval players and modern actors share the recuperative value of their art in the face of death. As the actor Quincy tells us at the end of Act 2, quote, "I think the voicelessness, this namelessness I have been suffering from. I mean, it isn't your brother dying from the Black Death, maybe, but I think it relates to the powerlessness we sometimes feel as mortal human creatures." The character of the playwright himself responds with a series of questions. Confronted with a crisis, what is the artistic impulse? If it's art we choose, then which is art? An ark to carry us over the waters? Or a nail that bleeds for us so that we can be healed? The power of art to remind us of our shared humanity and mortality, and to cope with the tragedy of death, is a message that is as poignant for us through COVID-19 today as we live through it, as it was for medieval witnesses of plague in the Middle Ages. Thank you. So I think we still have some time for questions.
One right here at the center.
Yes, please.
You mentioned the place and the personality, and everything that seems to be religious.
I'm having trouble hearing.
The everyday visualization or experience of the farm, it was mostly religious, but what was brought into the secular part? Did people have images in their houses? Or was it mostly religious?
Okay, so the question that is being asked is, are all of these images religious, or is this something that could be found in the secular sphere, right? The sphere of homes, for example. And I'd say yes and no, because it's really hard in medieval Europe to separate the religious and the secular spheres, because there's so much interpenetrating each other. Now, it's true, I'm talking primarily about Christian Europe, so that's a qualification. But you know, these burial places were public places where anyone could go, and people did. It's a custom we've lost by the late 20th century, which is that normally you go to the grave of a family member. So, I mean, that has religious aspects to it, but whether you were religious or not, that idea of remembering the dead was pretty much a shared universal value. Now, not everyone had an elaborate tomb, that tended to be for people who were much more affluent. Not everyone could afford an illustrated prayer book either, although that was something that the laity used. It had a religious function, but it was something that the laity used. And there's also a kind of interplay between the secular and the sacred in the image. Some of the images I showed you, there's a play on things like hunting and courtly love. These are things that are from the secular sphere. And things that people were aware of in street performances and in music. And so, again, it's hard to separate the sacred and profane. But what I want to emphasize is, yes, these images were pretty ubiquitous. They were available to people even if they couldn't afford a lavish illuminated manuscript. And that print that I showed you is late medieval. And of course, prints really kind of democratized images and their consumption, because they could be had much more cheaply and they were distributed much more widely. Yes?
There was a film in the 50s by Ingmar Bergman, The Seventh Seal. That's where the returning knight is competing for his life or death. Is that a familiar image too at the time?
Well, I think that may be partly based on the Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Yes, I mean, that's certainly what, again, that kind of imagery was popularized in print culture, famously by Albrecht Dürer. So in the 15th century, by the end of the 15th century, these images become much more widely diffused.
Time for one more. If anyone else has a question?
Yes.
So, in the 14th century, were there any discussions of how the plague in Europe may have been similar in kind to the plague of Athens at the end of the Peloponnesian War in the 400 BC, I think? So, like, I guess, to what extent were people looking at instances of plague that may have happened in the classical era?
Well, of course, there are biblical plagues, in the Israelites as they're departing from Egypt, or those series of plagues. So plagues were certainly part of the biblical tradition. There were plagues in earlier medieval Europe, famously in the 6th century, under the so-called Justinianic plague. And so there were certainly historical records, but because they didn't have a clear medical understanding of the sources of the plague, or even how it spread, when it came, it caught them unprepared. And it was, just as you could say that COVID-19 caught us unprepared, even though people have been warning about this kind of thing, when it actually happens. And when so many people are dying, it's, no matter what is in the history books, we tend to forget history, and history repeats itself. So, people were certainly aware of these kinds of events in the past, but most often they would attribute them to, divine intervention. They were being punished for something, or the individuals were being punished for something. Going back to Noah's flood, the idea that these were evil people who were being punished with death, and only so many people would be saved from this. So they were, there was some understanding of what was happening, to the extent that the Venetians created a quarantine. They had a whole island that was devoted to the plague victims so they wouldn't contaminate the entire population, and they stopped allowing ships to come into their ports. So they had some awareness of transmission. They had some awareness of sort of basic medical factors, but they didn't really know where it originated and how it happened. So, and only recently, the scientists are being able to isolate the virus, or isolate the plague. They found in remains in plague cemeteries from medieval Europe. This is one example in England from the 14th century, where they've been able to localize and figure out also where it came from. Now they've got pretty good, solid scientific evidence for where it came from and how it spread.
Thank you so much. That was just fantastic.